Kiesha Weippeart's story begins like a fairy tale, a bright-eyed 6-year-old girl with a smile that could warm even the coldest of hearts. She lived in a modest home in Mount Druitt, a suburb of Sydney, Australia, where she was known for her infectious laughter and boundless curiosity. Tragically, this innocence was overshadowed by a dark reality that would ultimately lead to her untimely demise. On a fateful day in August 2010, Kiesha was reported missing by her mother, Christy Abrahams, and her partner, Robert Smith. Their frantic pleas for help captured the attention of a nation, prompting widespread media coverage and an outpouring of concern from the public. Little did anyone know, this would be the beginning of a harrowing tale that would unveil a grim truth hidden beneath the surface. As the investigation unfolded, what began as a search for a missing child quickly transformed into a chilling narrative of neglect, abuse, and ultimately, murder. The initial sense of urgency that swept across Australia soon turned into a collective gasp of horror when the discovery of Kiesha's body shocked the nation. Buried in a shallow grave, her remains were found months later, igniting an outcry that reverberated through every corner of society. The details that emerged from the investigation painted a horrifying picture. Kiesha had been subjected to years of abuse at the hands of those who were meant to protect her. The very individuals who pleaded for public assistance in finding her were, in fact, her captors and tormentors. This heart-wrenching case raised profound questions about the systems in place for protecting vulnerable children. How could a little girl suffer so greatly without anyone intervening? The revelations of her abuse sparked outrage, igniting debates about the effectiveness of child welfare services in Australia. Despite numerous warning signs and reports of maltreatment, Kiesha remained in an environment that ultimately led to her tragic fate. This reality forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about its failures in safeguarding the most innocent among us. The anger and grief that followed Kiesha's death were palpable. Australians from all walks of life found themselves united in their condemnation of the systemic failures that allowed such a tragedy to occur. Calls for change echoed through communities. As parents, activists, and concerned citizens demanded a re-evaluation of child protection policies, Kiesha's story became a rallying cry for those advocating for reform, shining a spotlight on the urgent need to address the gaps in the system that had failed her so tragically. Kiesha Weippeart's story is not just one of a lost child, it is a testament to the societal responsibility we all share in protecting the vulnerable. It serves as a poignant reminder that we must remain vigilant and proactive in our efforts to ensure that no child experiences the horrors that Kiesha endured. As we delve deeper into this heartbreaking tale, we will explore the key events surrounding her disappearance, the investigation that followed, and the implications for child welfare in Australia. Through this examination, we hope to honor Kiesha's memory by advocating for a future where no child is left unprotected and unheard. On August 1, 2010, the morning sun cast a warm glow over Mount Druitt. But within one home, shadows loomed large. That day began like any other for 6-year-old Kiesha Weippeart. But it would soon spiral into a nightmare that would captivate and horrify the nation. As Christy Abrahams and her partner Robert Smith awoke to find Kiesha missing, the sense of panic began to seep into their voices. They claimed that she had vanished without a trace from their home, sparking an urgent search that would rally the community and the media. Kiesha's disappearance was immediately reported to the New South Wales Police. The initial response was swift. Local authorities launched an extensive search operation, involving search teams, helicopters, and volunteer efforts from residents eager to help find the little girl. The search focused on the immediate vicinity, canvassing the neighborhood and calling on locals to provide any information they might have. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting images of Kiesha's smiling face across the country. The plea from her mother resonated deeply with the Australian public: "Please, help us find our daughter." Such heartfelt appeals typically stir compassion and mobilize communities. And this case was no different. However, as days turned into weeks without any sign of Kiesha, the narrative began to shift. The initial fervor of the search began to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. For many, the lack of progress in locating Kiesha hinted at a darker reality. Questions arose about the circumstances of her disappearance, and suspicions about her mother and Smith started to swirl in the air like a chilling breeze. Those who had initially rallied to support the family began to wonder if the very individuals seeking help were hiding something more sinister. The investigation took a critical turn when police began to scrutinize the statements made by Christy and Robert. Their accounts of the events leading up to Kiesha's disappearance became the focal point of the investigation. A timeline was constructed, detailing their movements and interactions on that fateful day. It soon emerged that discrepancies in their statements raised eyebrows among investigators. For instance, Christy's portrayal of her daughter as a playful, carefree child began to clash with the growing concerns about Kiesha's well-being, as reports of abuse started to surface from various sources. As the investigation deepened, it became increasingly clear that the police were not just searching for a missing child, they were unraveling a complex web of familial dysfunction. Information began to trickle in regarding the tumultuous relationship between Christy and Robert. Their history was marked by instability, and red flags emerged that hinted at a pattern of neglect and abuse that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Neighbors and acquaintances came forward, sharing their observations about the household. Some noted that they had seen Kiesha with unexplained bruises, while others recalled instances where she appeared withdrawn and fearful. These testimonies added weight to the growing concerns that the environment Kiesha was living in was far from safe. The media, initially focused on the search, began to shift its attention to the investigation itself. Reports started to circulate about Christy's troubled past, including previous encounters with Child Protective Services. It became evident that Kiesha had been a child at risk, caught in a cycle of neglect and abuse. The public sympathy began to erode, replaced by anger and a demand for accountability. How could a little girl endure such suffering? And why had no one intervened to protect her? The turning point in the investigation came in April 2011 when the grim reality was laid bare. Kiesha's body was discovered in a shallow grave, wrapped in a blanket, concealed in a remote area of Shalvey. The news sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. It was a moment that transformed grief into outrage, as the true horror of the situation became painfully clear. The police had initially hoped for a different outcome, that Kiesha would be found alive and well. But the discovery of her remains marked the end of a search that had become increasingly desperate and fraught with tension. As details of the discovery emerged, the investigation transitioned from a missing person case to a murder inquiry. The forensic evidence gathered from the scene painted a chilling picture of the events that had transpired in the weeks leading up to Kiesha's death. Autopsy results revealed that she had died from blunt force trauma, and it became apparent that her mother, Christy, and her partner, Robert, were central figures in this tragic narrative. The community's initial outpouring of concern was replaced by a pervasive sense of betrayal. The very people who had sought help were now the primary suspects in the death of an innocent child. Investigators began to piece together the events leading up to Kiesha's murder. Interviews with Christy and Robert revealed a disturbing timeline of abuse and neglect. It was revealed that Kiesha had been subjected to physical violence and emotional torment, living in an environment fraught with danger. Witness accounts suggested that the couple had a volatile relationship, often resulting in heated arguments that further destabilized their household. It became evident that Kiesha was not just a victim of a tragic circumstance, she was a child trapped in a cycle of violence perpetuated by those who were meant to care for her. As the investigation continued, the emotional toll on the community deepened. Vigils were held in memory of Kiesha, where friends and strangers alike gathered to mourn the loss of a child who had captured their hearts. The outpouring of grief was palpable, as people grappled with the reality that a little girl's life had been cut short by the very people who should have loved and protected her. Community leaders and child advocates began to speak out, demanding systemic changes to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. Kiesha's story became emblematic of the urgent need for reform within child protection services, highlighting the failures that allowed her to remain in an abusive environment. The findings of the investigation were met with anger and frustration. Many questioned how the system could have failed Kiesha so profoundly. There were calls for accountability at every level, from the individuals who were supposed to protect her to the institutions that had the power to intervene. Public forums were held to discuss the shortcomings in child welfare policies, emphasizing the need for a more vigilant and proactive approach to safeguarding vulnerable children. As the legal proceedings began to unfold, the case became a focal point for media coverage, drawing national attention to the ongoing issues surrounding child abuse and neglect. The courtroom became a battleground for justice, where the memories of Kiesha were invoked in every argument and testimony. The community watched closely, waiting for answers and seeking solace in the hope that justice would be served for a child whose life was tragically cut short. Kiesha Weippeart's disappearance and the subsequent investigation serve as a poignant reminder of the vulnerability of children in our society. Her story, marked by innocence and tragedy, has left an indelible mark on the hearts of many. As we delve deeper into the events that followed her discovery, we must remember the lessons learned from her life and the collective responsibility we share in ensuring that no child experiences the horrors that Kiesha faced. The urgency for change and advocacy has never been more pressing, as we strive to create a safer world for all children. The discovery of Kiesha Weippeart's body in April 2011 marked a turning point in a case that had captivated Australia, transforming the narrative from one of hope to one steeped in despair. As the search teams combed through the dense underbrush of Shalvey, the community held its breath, praying for a miracle that would bring the young girl home safely. Instead, they were confronted with the devastating reality of her death. The news that a little girl, whose smile had once radiated joy, had been found lifeless, reverberated throughout the nation, plunging it into a deep sorrow that quickly turned into outrage. The circumstances surrounding the discovery were chilling. Kiesha's body was located in a shallow grave, wrapped in a blanket and concealed beneath debris in a secluded area. The site was a stark contrast to the vibrancy of her life. It represented the culmination of months filled with unanswered questions and a search that had yielded no results. The moment authorities confirmed the identity of the remains, it marked the end of a desperate search and the beginning of an agonizing chapter in the lives of those who loved her. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to Kiesha's tragic death, a grim picture emerged. The forensic examination revealed that she had died from blunt force trauma, suggesting that her demise was not just a tragic accident, but rather the result of a deliberate act of violence. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community and ignited a firestorm of anger directed at Christy Abrahams and Robert Smith. The couple, who had once pleaded for public assistance in finding Kiesha, now stood at the center of a murder investigation. The police began to delve deeper into the dynamics of the household, unraveling a history marred by abuse and neglect. Witnesses provided harrowing accounts of the living conditions within the Weippeart home. Neighbors recounted seeing Kiesha with bruises and other signs of physical harm, raising alarm bells that had gone largely unheeded by authorities. Reports of erratic behavior from Christy, coupled with the couple's tumultuous relationship, painted a picture of a chaotic environment in which Kiesha was perpetually at risk as the nation grappled with the heartbreaking loss of Kiesha Weippeart. The legal proceedings against her mother, Christy Abrahams, and her partner, Robert Smith, commenced. The courtroom became a theater of grief and anger, where the quest for justice for a young girl who had suffered so profoundly took center stage. With the public closely monitoring the trial, the stakes were incredibly high. It was not just about punishing those responsible, but also about addressing the systemic failures that had allowed such a tragedy to occur. The prosecution faced the daunting task of presenting a case that would reveal the full extent of the abuse Kiesha had endured. They began by outlining the timeline of events leading to her death, connecting the dots between Christy and Robert's turbulent relationship, their history of neglect, and the heartbreaking details surrounding the circumstances of Kiesha's demise. Witnesses, including neighbors and friends, provided testimony about the household's instability, sharing their observations of Kiesha's physical injuries and emotional distress. This testimony was crucial in establishing a pattern of abuse and neglect that had persisted for years, painting a clear picture of the environment in which Kiesha lived. Christy Abrahams's defense team attempted to construct a narrative that could mitigate her culpability, portraying her as a struggling mother overwhelmed by her circumstances. They argued that her actions were driven by the pressures of life rather than a deliberate intent to harm. However, as the evidence mounted, it became increasingly difficult for the defense to distance Christy from the reality of her actions. The jury was presented with the stark contrast between Christy's public persona as a concerned mother and the chilling reality of her private life, where violence and neglect had tragically defined her relationship with Kiesha. The emotional toll of the trial was palpable. Family members, friends, and community members filled the courtroom, their faces reflecting a mix of sorrow, anger, and a desperate yearning for justice. Every piece of evidence brought forth a flood of emotions, as those present were reminded of the vibrant young girl whose life had been cut short. The testimonies painted a haunting portrait of a child who had suffered far too much, stirring deep feelings of grief and outrage among all who were following the case. As the trial progressed, the prosecution revealed the full scope of Christy and Robert's involvement in Kiesha's death. They argued that Christy had been the primary perpetrator, responsible for inflicting the fatal injuries, while Robert's role was that of an accomplice, helping to cover up the crime and ultimately concealing Kiesha's body. The prosecution's narrative emphasized that both individuals had failed in their most fundamental duty, to protect and nurture a child. Their actions were not merely a result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather indicative of a broader pattern of violence and neglect that had persisted for years. After weeks of heart-wrenching testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated on the fate of Christy Abrahams and Robert Smith. The community held its breath, hoping for a verdict that would not only deliver justice for Kiesha but also signal a commitment to addressing the systemic issues that had failed her so profoundly. Finally, the jury returned with their verdicts, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Christy Abrahams was found guilty of murder, a verdict that confirmed the prosecution's assertions that she had deliberately taken the life of her daughter. The judge's sentencing reflected the gravity of her actions. Christy received a sentence of 22 years and 9 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 16 years. This decision sent a powerful message about the severity of her crime and the responsibility of parents to protect their children. For many in the community, the sentence was a step toward justice, albeit a bittersweet one, as it could never truly compensate for the life lost. Robert Smith, on the other hand, was found guilty of manslaughter and concealing a corpse. The court determined that while he had not inflicted the fatal injuries, his role in the cover-up and his failure to act were egregious enough to warrant significant punishment. He was sentenced to a minimum of 12 years in prison. This disparity in sentencing sparked discussions about the varying degrees of accountability, as many felt that both individuals should face harsher consequences for their involvement in such a tragic situation. The verdicts and subsequent sentencing were met with a wave of public reaction. Many Australians felt a mixture of relief and anger, relief that justice had been served, but anger that it had taken the tragic loss of a child to prompt such accountability. The case reignited conversations around child protection laws and the responsibilities of social services to intervene in cases of suspected abuse. Advocates for children's rights called for systemic changes to prevent future tragedies. emphasizing that the failures in Kiesha's case must not be repeated. In the wake of the trial, Kiesha's story became a catalyst for advocacy and reform. Community organizations rallied together to push for changes in child protection policies, emphasizing the need for better training for social workers and more resources to support at-risk families. The discussions surrounding the case highlighted the importance of listening to children and ensuring that their voices were heard in situations where their safety was at risk. The community united in its resolve to create a safer environment for all children, fueled by the memory of a little girl whose life had been tragically cut short. Kiesha Weippeart's case serves as a poignant reminder of the critical need for vigilance and compassion in safeguarding children. The legal proceedings that followed her death illuminated the complex interplay of abuse, neglect, and systemic failure, emphasizing the collective responsibility to protect those who are most vulnerable. As society reflects on the lessons learned from this heartbreaking tragedy, it is imperative to advocate for change, ensuring that every child is given the opportunity to grow up in a safe and nurturing environment. The journey toward justice for Kiesha may have concluded in the courtroom, but the impact of her story continues to resonate. It compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about child protection and the urgent need for reform. As we remember Kiesha, we are reminded of the profound responsibility we all share in creating a world where every child is cherished and protected, ensuring that her tragic fate is never repeated. In the days following the discovery of her body, investigators sought to reconstruct the timeline of events that led to Kiesha's death. They examined the couple's movements, analyzing phone records, texts, and witness statements. The pieces began to fit together, revealing a disturbing sequence of events. It became apparent that on the day of Kiesha's death, a violent altercation had occurred within the home, resulting in her fatal injuries. Evidence suggested that Christy, fueled by anger and desperation, had unleashed her wrath upon her defenseless daughter, leading to the tragic conclusion of Kiesha's short life. As the investigation progressed, the community's sense of betrayal deepened. The very individuals who had sought help from the public had been hiding a horrific truth. Christy and Robert's initial appeals for assistance now felt like a cruel mockery. The media coverage of the case shifted dramatically, transforming from hopeful searches to intense scrutiny of the couple's actions. Public opinion turned sharply against them, with many demanding justice for the little girl who had suffered so immensely. The emotional toll of Kiesha's death extended far beyond her immediate family. The collective grief and anger rippled through the community, prompting people to reflect on the failures of the child protection system that had allowed her to remain in such a dangerous environment. Child advocates and community leaders voiced their frustrations, demanding answers about how warning signs had been overlooked and why authorities had not acted sooner. The case raised critical questions about the effectiveness of child welfare interventions and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. As investigators closed in on Christy and Robert, they faced the daunting task of gathering enough evidence to secure a conviction. The pressure mounted as public scrutiny intensified. The narrative surrounding the case evolved into one not only about a mother's betrayal but also about the systemic failures that had contributed to Kiesha's suffering. Each revelation in the investigation brought forth more questions, not only about the individuals involved but also about the societal structures that had failed to protect a child in need. In the courtroom, the emotional weight of the case became palpable. The prosecution painted a harrowing picture of a young girl who had suffered at the hands of those who should have loved her most. Testimonies from witnesses brought to light the patterns of abuse that had persisted for years, painting a portrait of a child whose life was characterized by pain and neglect. The stark contrast between Kiesha's joyful spirit and the circumstances of her death left many in the courtroom in tears, unable to reconcile the loss of such innocence with the brutal reality of her life. As the legal proceedings began, the focus shifted towards seeking justice for Kiesha. Christy Abrahams and Robert Smith were charged with murder, and the courtroom became a space for the truth to emerge. even as it served as a reminder of the tragic fate that had befallen an innocent child. The nation watched closely, waiting for answers and hoping that the proceedings would honor Kiesha's memory and lead to meaningful change in the systems designed to protect children. The discovery of Kiesha Weippeart's body and the revelations that followed serve as a somber reminder of the vulnerability of children caught in cycles of abuse and neglect. Her story resonates deeply within the collective consciousness of Australia, highlighting the urgent need for systemic reform in child protection policies. As we continue to grapple with the implications of her tragic fate, we are reminded of our shared responsibility to ensure that no child endures the horrors that Kiesha faced. In the aftermath of her death, the community's outrage transformed into action, with many individuals and organizations advocating for changes that would safeguard future generations. The lessons learned from Kiesha's story serve as a catalyst for reform, driving home the message that vigilance, empathy, and accountability are essential in the fight to protect the most vulnerable among us in the aftermath of Kiesha Weippeart's tragic death and the subsequent legal proceedings. The public response was one of profound grief intertwined with outrage. Australians from all walks of life found themselves grappling with the reality of a system that had failed to protect a vulnerable child. The discovery of her body and the details that emerged during the trial ignited a firestorm of emotions, compelling citizens to confront the uncomfortable truths about child welfare in their society. The narrative surrounding Kiesha's case quickly shifted from one of tragedy to one of urgent demand for change, as voices across the nation called for a re-evaluation of how child protection systems operate. As news of Kiesha's story spread, community forums and vigils became a rallying point for those seeking justice not only for her but for all children who suffer in silence. Activists, social workers, and concerned citizens gathered to share their grief and anger, emphasizing that no child should endure the neglect and abuse that Kiesha faced. These gatherings became a platform for discussing the critical need for systemic reform in child protection policies. The haunting reality of Kiesha's death resonated deeply, prompting questions about how such a tragedy could happen in a society that professes to care for its children. Kiesha's case highlighted glaring deficiencies in the child welfare system, particularly regarding how reports of abuse were handled. Despite multiple warning signs, including previous encounters with child protective services and numerous reports from concerned neighbors, Kiesha remained in an environment that ultimately led to her death. The lack of timely intervention by authorities raised serious concerns about the effectiveness of existing protocols and the need for better training and resources for social workers. Advocates for children's rights emphasize that the system must be overhauled to ensure that the voices of children are heard and that their safety is prioritized above all else. Public outcry reached a crescendo as community leaders and child advocates lobbied for legislative changes aimed at strengthening child protection laws. Calls for greater accountability and transparency within child welfare agencies became central to the dialogue. The need for improved communication between agencies and law enforcement was underscored, as many felt that a more integrated approach could help identify and respond to at-risk children more effectively. The aim was to create a system that not only reacts to abuse but actively prevents it, ensuring that children like Kiesha are given the chance to thrive in safe, nurturing environments. In the face of such overwhelming grief and determination, the media played a crucial role in keeping Kiesha's story alive in the public consciousness. News outlets, documentaries, and social media platforms amplified the calls for reform, ensuring that her memory would not fade into obscurity. Journalists investigated the systemic failures that contributed to her tragic fate, shedding light on the broader issues of child abuse and neglect in Australia. This heightened awareness served to mobilize communities, encouraging individuals to advocate for change and to support organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. The ripple effects of Kiesha's case extended far beyond Mount Druitt, resonating with families across Australia. Parents began to engage more actively in discussions about child safety, advocating for a culture of vigilance and awareness regarding the signs of abuse. Schools and community organizations implemented programs aimed at educating children and adults alike about the importance of recognizing and reporting abuse. These initiatives sought to empower individuals to take action when they suspect a child may be in danger, reinforcing the message that safeguarding children is a collective responsibility. Kiesha's story also ignited a nationwide debate about the responsibilities of parents and caregivers. While many recognized the challenges faced by families living in difficult circumstances, there was a growing consensus that no child should be subjected to violence or neglect. The conversation shifted towards creating support systems for struggling parents, emphasizing the importance of early intervention and access to resources that can help families break the cycle of abuse. Advocates called for increased funding for mental health services, parenting programs, and community support initiatives aimed at fostering healthier family dynamics. As the movement for reform gained momentum, lawmakers began to take notice. In response to the widespread public outcry, discussions surrounding the need for legislative change became a priority. Policymakers were urged to review and revise child protection laws, ensuring that they reflect the urgency of the situation. The tragic fate of Kiesha Weippeart became a catalyst for legislative reform, as advocates pushed for policies that prioritize the welfare of children and provide clearer guidelines for intervention in suspected cases of abuse. In this climate of heightened awareness and advocacy, the memory of Kiesha Weippeart served as a poignant reminder of the collective responsibility to protect vulnerable children. Her tragic story became emblematic of the urgent need for change, inspiring a movement that sought to ensure that no child would suffer in silence. As communities rallied together, the hope was to create a future where every child is cherished and safeguarded from harm. The legacy of Kiesha's case lies not only in the pursuit of justice for her but also in the determination to transform the systems that failed her. As Australia reflects on the lessons learned from this heartbreaking tragedy, the emphasis remains on ensuring that such failures are not repeated. The calls for systemic change echo through the halls of government, community organizations, and homes, fostering a renewed commitment to child protection and the welfare of all children. In the years following Kiesha's death, her story has continued to resonate as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and action in the fight to safeguard children. The public outcry and subsequent calls for reform have laid the groundwork for meaningful change. As individuals and organizations work tirelessly to create a safer world for all children, the journey toward justice and reform is ongoing, driven by the collective will to honor Kiesha's memory and to ensure that her tragic fate becomes a catalyst for a brighter future. The tragic case of Kiesha Weippeart stands as a haunting reminder of the vulnerability of children and the urgent need for vigilance within society. As we reflect on the events surrounding her disappearance, the grim discovery of her body, the legal proceedings that followed, and the ensuing public outcry, we are confronted with the painful truths of a system that failed to protect an innocent life. Kiesha's story is one of heartbreak, but it is also a call to action, a powerful impetus for change that resonates deeply within the Australian conscience. Kiesha's life, though tragically short, has left an indelible mark on the fabric of society. Her case has sparked vital conversations about child protection, prompting a re-examination of policies and practices that govern the welfare of vulnerable children. As communities grapple with the implications of her tragic fate, there is a growing recognition of the collective responsibility to safeguard children from harm. The outrage and sorrow that followed her death have galvanized individuals and organizations to advocate for reforms that prioritize the protection and well-being of children, ensuring that no child endures the horrors that Kiesha faced. In the wake of Kiesha's death, the movement for change gained momentum, fueled by the realization that systemic failures must be addressed to prevent similar tragedies. Advocacy efforts have focused on improving child welfare services, enhancing training for social workers, and ensuring that those on the front lines of child protection are equipped with the tools they need to recognize and respond to signs of abuse effectively. The push for legislative reform reflects a commitment to creating a safer environment for children, one where their voices are heard and their safety is paramount. Moreover, Kiesha's story has ignited a broader dialogue about the importance of community involvement in protecting children. The outpouring of support and activism in her memory emphasizes that every individual has a role to play in safeguarding vulnerable children. Communities have rallied together, establishing programs aimed at educating parents, caregivers, and children about the signs of abuse and the importance of reporting concerns. This grassroots movement reflects a growing awareness that preventing child abuse requires collective effort and that we must stand united in our commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. As we reflect on the legacy of Kiesha Weippeart, we must also acknowledge the ongoing challenges that remain. The journey toward systemic change is not without its hurdles, and the fight to ensure that all children are protected from abuse and neglect continues. Each story of a child in crisis serves as a stark reminder of the work that still needs to be done, urging us to remain vigilant and proactive in our efforts to advocate for change. In closing, Kiesha's tragic story is a powerful testament to the importance of compassion, advocacy, and accountability in our society. Her memory serves as a guiding light, inspiring individuals and communities to take action in the face of injustice and to work tirelessly to ensure that no child is left unprotected. As we honor her life, let us commit to creating a world where every child is safe, cherished, and empowered to thrive. The lessons learned from Kiesha's case must echo through the corridors of our institutions, influencing policies, practices, and attitudes toward child protection. By standing together as a society, we can forge a future where every child has the right to a safe and nurturing environment, one where their laughter rings out without fear, and their innocence is safeguarded. The time for change is now, and it is our shared responsibility to ensure that the legacy of Kiesha Weippeart lives on in our collective actions, paving the way for a brighter and safer future for all children.